So welcome everyone, and a special welcome to our guests, Dr. Patrick Curry. He's going to give our lecture today. But I also wanted to especially acknowledge our additional special guests, Linda Cornell and Martha Payne. Welcome to you both. We're so thrilled for you to be here and so excited for you to be here. And I'm so thankful to both Linda and Martha. Today's event is sponsored by the Crabtree Cornell Fund for the Environment, which was established, which Linda and Martha established to support events engaging students in the Honors College with the ideas of the environment and sustainability. So thank you all so much for your generosity to the college. And we're so looking forward to today's event. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Patrick Curry, who insists that I call him Patrick. So we are very thankful for Patrick to be here lecturing today on ecology in Middle Earth. We're really excited to hear what you have to say. Dr. Curry is an eclectic scholar who studies many different and very interesting ideas. And I especially appreciate his scholarship on the Lord of the Rings. So without further ado, Dr. Curry.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. And thank you very much, Kenton, for inviting me and making this possible, and also for the funding, Linda. Thank you. And it's great to be virtually here. I'm talking to you from London, England. It's the evening here, so I've got a little artificial light so you can see me. And let's get started. So in a foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien condemns allegory as an attempt, the attempt by an author to dominate readers and tell them what to find and what not to find in the work. But he applauds what he calls applicability as the freedom of the reader to find whatever meanings they want to. Now, I can't believe it's so long, but a quarter of a century ago, I availed myself of the idea of applicability in order to suggest that Tolkien's work presents itself in three overlapping spheres: community, the Shire; secondly, the natural world, Middle-earth; and thirdly, spiritual values, the sea. And as the story begins, all three of these are in severe crisis. But by the end of it, that crisis has been resolved, albeit only just and at great cost. In this talk, I want to concentrate on the second aspect, nature. The observation that Middle-earth is a character in its own right has now become a truism. But there is a truth behind it, a very important one. It's the difference between a character and a stage prop. And the most fundamental characteristic of Middle-earth, the more than human natural world of Middle-earth, is that it is non-modern. It has not been made over by us or for us. It has not been forcibly converted, either culturally or materially, into an inert set of natural resources for industrialism to consume, or ecosystem services for it to exploit. This is not to say that that nature isn't used by the people living in Middle-earth. It's not a paradise, but for the most part, it is used sustainably in culturally reinforced ways, rather than brutally destroyed or ruthlessly exploited. But even where that is happening, and we shall get to that in a moment, the key point is that the natural world of Middle-earth is alive. I don't mean alive in some idealist sense of being a single, unified, supernatural entity. I also don't mean alive in the scientific sense of biologically, or you might say technically alive. That's a criterion which leaves most of the earth as dead. I mean that Middle-earth itself possesses the properties of agency, subjectivity, and personality, which manifest through and as its parts. At various times and in various ways, not only its non-human animals, but the rivers, mountains, and forests that we encounter in Middle-earth act in that way. Not a single one of those is generic, merely part of the environment, that is, a backdrop to the all-absorbing human drama. They're not like that. They have their own agendas. And the word encounter there is meant to remind us that those properties are not universally or necessarily true in the manner of so-called laws of nature. Rather, that agency, that subjectivity, that personality on the part of a river or forest or whatever comes alive in the lived experience of the people, both human and non-human, who are making their way through Middle-earth, and in the experience of the readers who are making their way through the story. Tolkien declared in a letter towards the end of his life that, quote, "In all my works, I take the part of trees against all their enemies." So let's start there. The mood, and I use that word advisedly, of Mirkwood from The Hobbit is distinctly dark and unfriendly. The trees of the old forest also, quote, "do not like strangers, they watch you." Old Man Willow, as you will remember if you've read it, deliberately targets the hobbits. Lothlorien is also unique in a very different way as the exemplar of natural enchantment in Middle-earth. In Aragorn's words, the heart of elvendom on earth. It's there that most of the species of plants of Tolkien's own creation grow. Melarin or Malorn, Elenor, and Nifredil. Fangorn Forest is distinctive in another kind of way. It's fully realized in the Ents who live there and mind it, particularly Treebeard. And the Ents, I think, are compelling not because they're humanoid, and I looked that up in the dictionary, it's defined as a non-human creature with human form or characteristics. They are compelling precisely because they are sentient and mobile trees. In other words, we don't meet the Ents as honorary humans, a status that we graciously grant them, in tree form, but on the wild and leveling common ground of shared, more than human, sentience. Sometimes I think that truly understanding nature could be summed up as, it's not about us. On another occasion, when Aragorn breathes upon and crushes 2 leaves of athelis, or kingsfoil, a herb, for Faramir, quote, "straightway a living freshness, filled the room, as if the air itself awoke." Don't miss that, the air itself awoke, and tingled, sparkling with joy, end quote. But trees, forests, and other plants are not the only beings in Middle-earth with agency. Some of them are non-organic. This is definitely pushing the edges of what we, as modern people, think is possible. The mountain Caradhras actively prevents the company of the ring from crossing the Redhorn Pass by bringing down on them storm and snow, and stopping only when that intention, which Aragorn describes as ill will on the part of a mountain, when that intention has been accomplished. And on the stairs of Cirith Ungol, when Frodo laughs in that dire place, quote, "a long, clear laugh from the heart," to Sam suddenly it seemed as if all the stones were listening and the tall rocks leaning over them. Now, that "seemed" is misleading. Consistent with Middle-earth's non-modernity, and I believe Tolkien's own intention, I'm arguing that we take completely seriously the forest's mood, the mountain's malice, the air's joy, the stone's listening. To quote the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, incidentally a great opponent of modern scientism, quote, "If everything behaves as though a sign had meaning, then it does have meaning," end quote. More specifically, it has the meaning it seems to have. That's the most economical and respectful and truthful assumption to make. At this point, someone might be tempted to wheel out the usual armory of modernist defenses that are used to police nature and protect human privilege. You thought or imagined these things, but actually you were projecting them onto what was incapable of them, what is incapable of them. You may even be guilty of anthropomorphizing, a serious modern sin. To people like that, I would say, check your epistemological privilege. Those weapons are based on a set of assumptions and values, originally Platonic, later Cartesian, which are deeply problematic. Indeed, comparing those assumptions about what the earth is and isn't and can do and can't do to the indigenous and aboriginal human baseline of a living nature, which is far deeper and older, reveals the modern assumptions as what they always were. Not an objective, scientific account, but a set of recent and aberrant interventions in the service of what the ecofeminist philosopher Val Plumwood defines as the overarching project of modernity, the mastery of nature, including human nature. In other words, those interventions, those descriptions are actually interventions in the world. They are intended to bring about what they purport to merely describe, an inert nature, essentially dead nature, which can be commodified and controlled and exploited or destroyed at will. Because you see, considerations of ethics don't arise for objects. They only arise for other subjects. Tolkien ultimately wrote as an artist crafting a tale. He naturally put his own values into the story, but his own values were a mixed bag, as for all of us. And he rightly felt no obligation to be logically consistent, as if he was writing an allegory or a political tract or a philosophical work. So there are several different attitudes and practices towards nature in The Lord of the Rings that coexist. Let's see what they are. One is the one I've just been describing. Its extreme expression in The Lord of the Rings is Sauron's Mordor. Here the attitude to nature is entirely instrumental and power over. Nature is only regarded as something to be used. Tolkien accurately portrays the inevitable result. As you will maybe already know, the description of what lies before the gates of Mordor, quote, "Here nothing lived, not even the leprous growths that feed on rottenness. The gasping pools were choked with ash and mud, sickly white and grey, as if the mountains had vomited the filth of their entrails upon the lands about. High mounds of crushed and powdered rock, great cones of earth fire-blasted and poisoned, stood like an obscene graveyard in endless rows." Almost indistinguishable is the brutal utilitarianism of Saruman, in imitation of Sauron, of course. As Treebeard describes Saruman, he is plotting to become a power. He has a mind of metal and wheels, and he doesn't care for growing things except insofar as they serve him for the moment. The terminus of Sauron and Saruman's attitudes is identical where it ends up. They end up in the same place. When Saruman rules the Shire, in Farmer Cotton's words, they're always hammering and letting out a stench. and they've fouled all the lower water, and it's getting down into Brandywine, the next river. If they want to make the Shire into a desert, they're going the right way about it. Yet this attitude actually goes beyond exploitation to encompass an irrational hatred of natural beauty and vitality as such. As Farmer Cotton adds, there is no longer even any bad sense in it. Treebeard points to what he calls Orc Mischief. Quote, some of the trees they just cut down and leave to rot. And Legolas observes of orcs that, quote, no other folk make such a trampling. It seems their delight to slash and beat down growing things that are not even in their way. Tolkien puts his finger here on a perversely malevolent knot in the human psyche. Perverse because it's self-destructive too. Now, the strongest possible contrast with this is, of course, the love of nature, especially by the elves. The elves are exemplars of enchantment in The Lord of the Rings, and I think one of the chief ornaments of his work. They mark it out from so many other works of fantasy in which there's simply no equivalent to the elves. I'm thinking, for example, of Games of Thrones. What am I thinking of? I hate it so much.
Game of Thrones.
Game of Thrones, yeah. There's no equivalent to the elves, and there's no enchantment, to say the least. It's true of a lot of works of fantasy. Tolkien describes the elves as, quote, natural, far more natural than humans, with a, quote, devoted love of the physical world and a desire to observe and understand it for its own sake and as other, not as a material for use or as a power platform. Tolkien also refers to the elves' chief motive as, quote, the adornment of the earth and the healing of its hurts. Tolkien defined enchantment itself as, and this is very significant, I think, quote, a love and respect for all things, whether animate or inanimate, an unpossessive love of them as other, end quote. Note how that understanding includes the lack of any sharp distinction between technically animate and technically inanimate. It returns us to the living non-modern nature where we started out, which is true of all of Middle-earth, and I suspect reminds us of when it was true and how it might still be true of our Earth. The only modern place in all of Middle-earth with a centralized state, a highly developed bureaucratic administration, heavy industry, slave-based agriculture, intense military apparatus, and an aggressive foreign policy is, of course, Mordor. The elves' love of the earth is not necessarily simple, however. I believe there's two variants, both of which are recognized in contemporary environmental philosophy, or as I would rather say, ecological philosophy. The first variant is usually called stewardship, and it is largely of Christian provenance, or has come to be seen that way, drawing its warrant from Genesis 1:24 and 2:15. In its simplest terms, since the earth and all its creatures are God's creations, they share something of his value, so it is humanity's responsibility to take care of them. Stewardship exists in tension with something called the dominion thesis, which also draws its warrant from Genesis, but verse 1:26 and 28, according to which humanity has dominion over all creatures. And therefore, in the commonest interpretation, I'm afraid, whether or not it is the correct one, we can basically do whatever we want with them or to them. Now, it's not surprising, given that Tolkien was both a great defender and lover of trees and a very committed practicing Catholic. It's not surprising that stewardship found its way into the Lord of the Rings. Explicitly, for example, in another letter of his in which he says, Lothlorien is beautiful because there the trees were loved and taken care of course. And if you think about it, the Ents are themselves stewards to the trees of Fangorn. Treebeard uses the image of shepherds. This variant coexists, however, with a different one, a different version of a loving relationship with nature, one that actually resonates more closely with Tolkien's own definition of enchantment as love of all things as other. That is, for their own sake, rather than even for God's sake. No, for their own sake alone. Such an attitude entails a recognition and respect for the intrinsic value, not the use value, the intrinsic value of the earth and of earthlings, including us, by the way. We're as earthlings like all the others. Intrinsic value as opposed to their instrumental value or use value or exchange value and so on. The best overall name for this idea is ecocentrism, as opposed to anthropocentrism, which finds value mostly or even only in humans alone. You could also contrast ecocentrism with theocentrism, where the theo is specified as the one true God of monotheism. But in practice, since God putatively made man in his own image, theocentrism functions overwhelmingly, I say in practice, as a placeholder for human-centeredness. So in that sense, it's another version of anthropocentrism. There are at least two clear instances of ecocentrism in The Lord of the Rings. In one, Goldberry, when asked if the Old Forest belonged to Tom Bombadil, replies, almost shocked, "No, indeed. The trees and the grasses and all things growing or living in the land belong each to themselves." That's a pretty good definition of ecocentrism. And indeed, gradually, the hobbits, quote, began to understand the lives of the forest apart from themselves. Indeed, began to feel themselves as the strangers where all other things were at home. In the second instance of ecocentrism, Frodo in Lothlorien, quote, laid his hand upon the tree beside the ladder. Never before had he been so suddenly and so keenly aware of the feel and texture of a tree's skin and of the life within it. He felt a delight in wood and the touch of it, neither as forester nor as carpenter. It was the delight of the living tree itself. So the tree as itself was what mattered, not what a human being could do with it, or even what a human being could do for it. Finally, I want to bring up a related term, another term, a related one, an associated concept and value. Returning to my earlier point about way making, that is, making one's way through Middle-earth, whether as a denizen of Middle-earth or as a reader. Animism is the principled habit as one goes through life of staying open to agency and subjectivity, no matter where and how they manifest. Not policing yourself and going, oh my God, I think that stone just communicated something to me, that's impossible, so I must have imagined. No. We don't do that. If something communicates to you, whatever it is, whether technically it can or not, you take it seriously as a principle. That's why I call it a principle. And you also stay open to any relationship with the other, whatever it is, or whoever it is, that ensues. Often that's a relationship which results in you learning something new. So we can think of animism as an important part of ecocentrism in practice. I must admit that personally, I've been living with ecocentrism, at least as an idea and as an intention, for so long that I'm starting to forget how to understand its contrary. Why exactly is it so important that everything be for or about humans? Or let alone for or about me? At any rate, at the closing of The Lord of the Rings, we are heading into the fourth age, which is termed the Age of Men. Somehow always gives me a slightly sinking feeling. It's already been named the Anthropocene. And however dispassionately the term was meant by geologists, it has been seized upon with unmistakable triumphalism by followers not particularly of stewardship, but just as much and possibly more the dominion thesis, who seem to think, against all the weight of the evidence, that they not only have the right to manage the earth, but the ability. Strange idea. And solely for our benefit, of course. And when I say our, not everybody's of our benefit, a very small number of people usually. Do you think Tolkien foresaw this development with his Age of Men? He seems to have foreseen ecological devastation, generally, the desolation of Mordor, genetic engineering, Saruman's man-orcs, the transhumanist cyborgs condemned to limitless serial longevity, which they confuse with immortality, those are the ring wraiths. I don't know, but they're certainly all there in his book. And so are the seeds of resistance to them, in line with Elrond's admonition, quote, "There is naught you can do other than to resist, with hope or without it." And which incidentally is why in some of my writings I say, hope is a great thing, but you may have to do without it. In terms of resisting, there is, in my opinion, a more important value, and that's courage. Tolkien was a great fan of courage, or what he called grit in a tight place. It's what he used to distinguish between, in a conversation between the hobbits, distinguish between Gandalf and Saruman. The hobbits said basically Saruman hasn't got that, and Gandalf does. And I find it interesting and significant that The Lord of the Rings has already inspired at least, or helped inspire, at least 2 eco-activist movements in the so-called real world since it was first published. One was in 1972, which I remember, but you may not, when David McTaggart sailed his small sailboat into a nuclear testing zone in the Pacific in order to stop it from happening. And this action led directly to the formation of Greenpeace. In his diary, he wrote, "I had been reading The Lord of the Rings, and I could not help thinking of parallels between our own little fellowship and the long journey of the hobbits into Mordor." Another instance of Tolkien-inspired activism, eco-activism, was the courageous and surprisingly successful movement in the mid-1990s here in England to resist the Thatcher government's program of building large, new, intrusive, and completely unnecessary roads in the remaining English countryside. I can personally attest that many of the campaigners, almost certainly most of them, not only knew The Lord of the Rings, but were living it. And proponents of one bypass, set to run straight through the middle of Dartmoor, attacked them in print as, quote, "Middle-earth hobbits." When he was asked by Merry whose side in the War of the Ring he was on, Treebeard replied, "I'm not altogether on anyone's side because nobody is altogether on my side. Nobody cares for the woods as I care for them." But I like to think that even Treebeard would have been impressed by those campaigners and activists. And Treebeard did add, "There are some things, of course, whose side I am altogether not on." For those of us who at least also are altogether not on that other side, the thought of standing alongside someone like him, an ancient living creature of the forests and the earth itself, I think strengthens our conviction and our will. Thank you very much. Thank you. I finished far too quickly, so I hope you're going to ask me lots of difficult and challenging questions.
Yeah, excellent. So we do have mercifully so much time for questions. So I'm looking forward to some excellent questions from y'all. Anybody want to kick us off? You can just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes. Hello.
Hi.
This is a quote from you, but it's a quote from another thing, so it might be a little bit out of context.
Okay.
So if you could just explain it, that's my question.
Sure.
This says, Patrick Curry argues that the connection between people and their place offers an escape from bloated solipsism, replacing it with a sense of perspective, context, and sanity. Can you explain that a little bit?
Okay, could you repeat the first part of it? Patrick Curry argues that
the connection between people and their place offers an escape from bloated solipsism.
Okay, the key thing about, I'm tempted to say everything, it's certainly true of ecocentrism, is relationship. So without going off on a tangent too much, I hope, there is at least one important difference between ecocentrism and an earlier forerunner of it, which was called deep ecology. And deep ecology said it's all about the self with a capital S, and we want to take our limited human self and expand it till the self includes all of nature and includes the. From an ecocentric point of view, that's the wrong way to go about it, because there is no self without another. You are defined by the others in your life, and the others are defined by you. So that it's always self in relationship. And of course, that's what ecology is. It's the study of relationships, okay? But not only in the scientific sense of you're outside this set of relationships in this environment and you're observing them. You're in the environment, you're in the thing you're studying because you're implicated in those relationships. To be alive is to be in relationship. So solipsism means to be trapped in yourself, you know. There is no other, which is like either a delusion or a terrible, terrible nightmare. So anywhere where relationship is important, and in the case of the quote that you've brought forward, it's the relationship between yourself and place or places. You know, solipsism is not an option. It's you're co-evolving with the place and the person are co-evolving together recursively, each affecting the other and learning from the other. And there's something else important about relationship. In true relationship, nobody is in charge. It's not like one party of the relationship is running the show. That's not a relationship. That's just domination, okay? Why is nobody in charge in a real relationship? Because you're not the other party or the other person. So you can't tell what they're going to do. They're capable of surprising you. And isn't that ultimately a good thing? It's part of being alive to be surprised. In other words, relationship is wild. You can't be domesticated, really, ultimately. Whereas domination, the program of, what did I call it, quoting Val Plumwood, the mastery of nature, and including human nature as the defining project of modernity, it's not about relationship. It's about mastering, okay? Being in charge, running the show for your benefit, et cetera, et cetera. So it's radically different. Does that answer your question? Oh, okay, good.
Question.
So,
sorry, Dylan,
sorry.
did you want to go? Okay. In our class, we tried to have kind of a critical gaze in some ways of the elves, because a lot of like the movies and the films kind of idealize them.
Yeah.
So you made some comments about the elves as that an exemplar of enchantment and like their relationship with nature.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you pointed out is that like they have managed some of their like environment with like the arbor that the hobbits encounter early after they leave the Shire, and then like only like the forest and Malorn trees and Lothlorien. And so I just wanted to see what your thoughts were there on just like maybe management in general, and if there's like an ideal version of that and the elves relationship in that.
Yeah, that's a complex question. First of all, I have to say I hope I don't offend anybody, but I'm not a big fan of the movies compared to the books. Now that may just be my problem because I know the books so well that every time he changed something, I was like outraged, you know? And also the elves come across terribly in the movie because I guess it's impossible to film them. The elves, are they role models? Are they wholly admirable? Actually, the more you look into the elves, if you study the appendices and the history of Middle-earth and so on, Tolkien, on the one hand, Tolkien says in a letter somewhere, I meant the elves to, I brought the elves into my story for two reasons. One, to highlight the importance of enchantment, which is not about what use the other person is for me or the other or anything is for me, but just love and admiration and non-possessive love of the other, as themselves. And the difference between that and what he called magic, and he identified magic with technology. So the greatest magician in Middle-earth is Sauron, the most powerful magician. Okay. The other reason he brought them in was he said, I wanted to emphasize certain potentialities for certain aesthetic, philosophical potentialities of human beings or attributes of human beings which are admirable. So that's fine. But once you start thinking about the elves and learning more about them, as I have been recently, they do some, in the history of Middle-earth, they do some terrible things. They're very possessive of the jewels of Feanor, and they start wars in order to get them back from Sauron, and lots of people die. Secondly, they're, even in less dramatic terms, they're not perfect. Okay, what's the chief elvish weakness? They live, okay, so elves are immortal. So unless they're killed, they live forever. They can be killed, but unless they kill, they live forever. So Tolkien said humans have fantasies about what it would be like to live forever. Elves have fantasies about what it would be like to die. Because I'm so tired of this life. It just goes on and on and on. And people I make friends with and animals that I love, they all die. And then the next lot die. And then the next lot die. So couldn't we just stop everything the way it is? Couldn't we preserve everything, just like stop time and keep everything the way it is right now? Wouldn't that be great? That's the elvish sin or weakness. And it's not a good model because it doesn't work. So Galadriel says, yes, here is Lothlorien. It's so beautiful and so peaceful and humming with what we would call magic, but should be called enchantment. But eventually, the tides of time will sweep it away. Elves try and resist that. Completely futile. You cannot resist it. You can put up a fight for a while, but sooner or later you're going to lose. So a really together elf would be the one that acknowledges this, that it can't succeed, that what an elf most wants to do ultimately can't succeed, and would let go. And in a way, Galadriel does that. She refuses the ring of, the ring of power, which she could use to sort of like make things more the way she wants them, and says, no, I'm going to just remain me, and I will shrink into a little old lady, and I will go into the West, and boom. So it's quite complicated.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So earlier you were talking about how like relationships foster understanding and knowledge. How would you suggest that we foster the formation of relationships between like humanity as a whole and the ecosystem?
How long have you got? Okay, so if I talked about enchantment, I talked about relationship being wild. Enchantment is the wonder, is those moments of wonder that occur in relationship, or that occur as a result of encounters with others. So by implication, and I believe this is true, enchantment is wild as well. You cannot script it, you cannot make it happen. Part of the reason enchantment is so wondrous is that nobody made it happen. It's a gift. It comes as a gift from who knows or whatever, but as a gift, not as something you can order up through Amazon or any other way. And that's precisely its value. So honing that down very slightly into natural enchantment, how can we encourage the natural enchantment to flourish? Natural enchantment flourishes in wildness, not wilderness necessarily. Note the difference between wilderness and wildness is very important. Thoreau said in wildness is the preservation of the world. He didn't say wilderness. I'm not saying wilderness isn't important. It's very important. It's where it's the most wild state of nature, okay? But there is still wildness wherever there are any little bits of nature that haven't been completely made over to our own, for our own purposes, okay? So you cannot, what I'm trying to say is, you cannot make a healthy ecosystem. You cannot force by willpower and all the skill in the world, you cannot force nature to flourish. All you can do, and believe me, this is going to take all we've got, is to create the conditions for nature itself to flourish, to take its own direction, to do its own thing. If you create those conditions, which do, and that does need a lot of willpower and knowledge and application, and etc. If you create those conditions, then it may or may not bless you by happening. And if it does, it'll be fantastic. And if it doesn't, you learn what you can and move on. So that's, I would say, both the least we can do and the most we can do.
I have one.
Mm-hmm.
This is sort of a question about the concept and value of an author's original intent. So do you believe that the reader's interpretation of a book is a valid way of interpreting what it means? And how much weight should an author's original intent really have on one's interpretation of their story?
I'm kind of old school on this. I believe that that once a text has been published, or a painting put out there, or a piece of music put out there, it achieves a kind of semi-autonomy, and you can have a relationship with that work itself in which you are perfectly entitled to find meanings that the author never even imagined, or applications. And that's, of course, what Tolkien meant by applicability. If you get into the question of what did he intend, what did this author, I'm saying he because I'm thinking of Tolkien, intend to do, That's an interesting question, but it's a different question. It's teaching you about Tolkien, the person. Whereas, personally speaking, my interest has always been more The Lord of the Rings, the book. And I can see what Tolkien put into it. He put all kinds of things. He put his love of language and his knowledge of languages. He put his deeply felt Christian beliefs. But he also put enormous respect for Northern European paganism, pagan culture, and its values, such as courage. So you'll find in The Lord of the Rings a huge emphasis on pity. The only reason the ring is destroyed is why? Because Gollum, in the end, destroys it as a sort of like act of grace, right? Gollum of all people, right? Why was that possible? Because both Bilbo and Frodo did not kill Gollum when they could have. So, pity is very important, but courage is also very, very important value. Gandalf is the exemplar of courage. So even if things look hopeless, you have to go on. Well, that's not a Christian value, that's a pagan value. So I can see, okay, Tolkien was really anti-modernist. He hated modernity. But how that's why Mordor is the only modern state and it's completely pathological. But it doesn't mean that I have to read that book and go, oh, okay, modernity is completely pathological. No, it's in my freedom to nuance that, to finesse that, to come up with other meanings. So I would say the right of the reader to find their own meanings in a work of art ultimately takes priority. Yeah.
Thank you. I agree.
Okay, thanks.
I think we're just about out of time, so we won't maybe take any other questions. But let's thank our speaker. Again, thank you so much, Patrick, for taking your time to visit with us. Thanks again to the Crabtree Cornell Fund for the Environment for supporting us and making this possible. And then just a quick pitch for tomorrow's special event, also with Dr. Curry. He will be visiting virtually with us again tomorrow, which is Thursday at 4. So hope to see many of you back for that. And thanks again so much, Patrick.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you very much. Thank you all.